At the start of the conference, I mentioned that at Adelaide Capital, we've tried to approach these difficult times with positivity and a sense of community. I think the most positive change I've noticed in this is that while staying physically distant, we've all felt a stronger connection to each other and to humankind. And the technology that we take for granted and often complain about in our daily lives has allowed us to stay very connected and engaged. And really, at least for me, has redefined a sense of community. And that I think is really powerful. Like, we're not alone in this fight, even if you live alone like I do. We have each other, and globally, we have a vast wealth of medical and scientific professionals, all solely focused on one problem. You heard some of them here today, but there are many, many more great minds working on solving this pandemic. So that's something I carry with me. I heard Dr. Balboni say something along those lines a few weeks ago in the webinar that I listened to, and it stuck with me and has given me a lot of hope. So I do believe that together we'll find a way out of this crisis. So there you have it. But that sentimental thought out of the way. For those of you who don't know Eden, he's Canada's most renowned biotech investor. He's been a friend of mine for not that long, just since I think I started working with microbics 2 or 3 years ago. But he's taught me a lot about the sector, and I thought it'd be a great way to kind of close out the session is to hear from an expert that knows how to invest exactly in this space. So Eden, thanks so much for joining us.
Very much for having me, Deborah, and kudos to you and the team for putting together this this excellent and timely conference, and assembling a great group of companies that are forging a path forward that is going to clear a way for us to sort of reemerge as a functioning society.
Yeah,
and it's important. And it's good to see Canadian innovation on display here today. Just as Deborah mentioned, I'm the portfolio manager for Canada's only fully registered biotech, small mid-cap biotech mutual fund. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been managing healthcare biotech investments for about 25 years, 10 years at RBC. Had a run of around 26% compound rate of return, then another 10 years or so at Jovian and Horizons. Doing a variety of things, mostly derivative-based and through their covered call ETFs. And for the last 5 years here at Next Edge Capital, where I manage this biotech fund. And I'm really honored to be asked by Deborah and her team to talk about this very topical subject. But before I actually dig into COVID investing, I'd like to just give a brief overview of the promise that the biotech sector has right now, because what you've actually seen during this crisis is that it's really come to the fore that biotechnology is the promise of the future, and that the world in this crisis has turned to biotechnology for the solutions that can give us some semblance of what the old world looked like and help us get back on our feet, help us function again. And so it's been a long time coming to get to this point. And again, we're really fortunate that unlike previous periods, the technology that biotech brings to bear has now been proven in the clinic. We have great companies with blockbuster drugs. The technology has evolved to a point where technology and biotechnology has fused together to make it really possible to address crises such as we have right now. So just briefly, we've seen enormous breakthroughs in the past decade. Cystic fibrosis, we've seen HIV subdued. So there are a lot of parallels actually with the outbreak of HIV in the 1980s and the solutions that were brought to bear to address that, which at the time it seemed insurmountable. But biotech found the solutions, and now we have vaccines that can protect against HIV, which is extraordinary. We've seen hepatitis C cured. We've seen cystic fibrosis subdued. And in the future, we'll see gene editing technology that perhaps cures cystic fibrosis by correcting a single gene. So science fiction has become science fact. And the tools that we have now to address this are just incredible. one of the extraordinary things we've seen, as we've seen in technology, we all know about Moore's law when it comes to semiconductor processing power, but we've seen it in biotech to an even larger degree. So 20 years ago, the first human genome was sequenced at a cost of $3 billion and took a decade to do. The same thing can be done for under 1,000 now in a matter of days. Again, unbelievably extraordinary that which seemed inconceivable just 20 years ago is now rudimentary. This is a technology that biotech is bringing to COVID. Now, biotech has come to the fore, but it's been a tough 5 years in the sector. So it's a very young industry. It was only born publicly in 1980 when Genentech IPO'd in October of 1980. Since then, we've had 5 major cycles. Following each sort of bear market cycle, we've had bull markets that run several years. The worst bull market that we've had was in the 2000s that went up 100%, but many stocks were double that. But most of the bull markets we have in biotech ranges somewhere between 300% and 1,000%, run several years. The reason why I mention this is because for the past 5 years, we've been stuck in a range. And biotech has had 3 bear markets, one of over 40%, 2 of around 30%. So it's been a really tough 5-year period. But what we've seen is that biotech has begun to bubble up, and it's among the strongest sectors coming out of the sell-off that we've had, the crisis sell-off that we've had in March. And I think the reason is that investor money is moving towards the sector because they realize it is a sector of the future. It is a sector that will solve the problem that we face right now. And it's traditionally a very complex sector, hard to understand, hard to invest in. And that's because biology takes time. It takes time to develop a drug. It takes time to enroll patients, to test it for safety, to test it for efficacy, to analyze the data, to overcome all these hurdles. So, typically you'll have thousands of candidates in preclinical testing in animals and in vitro. And you go through that, you identify a drug that potentially you want to take into human trials. You go through phase 1. That will take a couple of years. You're testing just for dosing and safety. If that works, you start a couple of phase 2 trials, an open label phase 2, and then a controlled phase 2. And then if the drug makes it through phase 2, which is very difficult because most drugs actually fail after phase 2, the success rate is only 30%. But if it goes into phase 3, you can design a trial with a bit more clarity. You can enroll the correct number of patients, a correct type of patient, and your success rate goes up to about 60%. And then you submit the results of that for FDA approval. And that whole process is about a decade. Different biotech investors invest in different phases. Some, Canada has a booming venture capital sector, and they invest primarily in preclinical and incubating companies and so on. I don't. Other investors favor phase 1 and pre-phase 2. I don't. I favor post-phase 2 investments because at that point, you really don't have to rely on management. You rely on the data of the trials. You rely on key opinion leaders that can scrutinize the data and fight among themselves as to whether this drug that has succeeded phase 2 is going to be successful, whether it materially impacts how you treat patients or not. And so that's the phase that I focus on. But the whole process takes about 10 years. And as I mentioned, in that long process, that small gray shaded area is where I like to focus. Again, other investors are very successful investing in other phases. Other investors focus on post-commercialization. But for me, on a risk-reward basis, I like that because you generate very high returns with much lower clinical development risk. Now we focus on why you actually are listening to this, and that is handicapping and finding investments for companies that are developing therapies for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. As most of us already know, this virus it's very contagious. It's more contagious than the flu, but it's to this point less virulent. Now, the reason why the mortality rate is much higher than the flu is we really don't have anything that can treat it to this point. We will in the future, but at this point we don't. So we don't panic as much as we would if we were to get the flu. If we were to get the flu, we know that there are steps we can take. We understand how it works and how you treat it. The problem with COVID-19 is that it's highly contagious and it's spreading fast, and we don't have the means yet to treat it. And that's where the fear and the panic comes in. The only thing that can address this is biotechnology. And all the companies that were here today are vital in us getting to that point where we could subdue this. Now, it's been the wild west as far as COVID-19. Companies throwing a hat into the ring to develop therapies for it, and there are multiple approaches. There are some companies that are trying to develop antibodies against it. There are other companies that are working on vaccines, prophylactic, preventative vaccines, which are very important, but it's a longer timeline. There are companies that are developing antivirals. So from the moment you're infected, you need something that could actually inhibit the reproduction of the virus in you. And there are others. A big segment of it are repurposed drugs. So there are a lot of companies that are out there that it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. You're hoping something sticks. So there are a lot of companies that will cite some paper that shows that their drug at some point had some kind of antiviral effect, and they're going to the clinic. Now, going into the clinic itself, the FDA will approve that you can run a trial on it. That itself is not an endorsement of your drug. It's merely saying that the FDA has lowered the bar considerably and they want to advance any treatment that may potentially prove to have some kind of efficacy against the virus. And so you have this gold rush that's going on. So a lot of companies have had big advances because it's that much of a headline chasing type environment that we're in right now. Most of these companies will not turn out to be good investments. So as we'll discuss a little bit further on, there are questions investors have to ask themselves before they actually invest in this gold rush that's going on right now. So I mentioned that we had antivirals that will target different spaces. And I know it's a complex slide and you don't have to worry about the details, but this is important because it paves the way for how we think and where the treatments are coming in. So this is a slide only of the point where you're infected. It's not the vaccine stage where you're preventative, or it's not at the advanced stage when you go through something called the cytokine storm, where your body's now battling back. So this is the phase where something like remdesivir is activated, and there are other drugs that are put on a table for you. And what it is that, so the virus comes in, targets a couple of receptors on your cell, gets into your cell. It then targets the reproductive aspect of your cell, where it uses your DNA replication assembly to reproduce itself. Now, what's different about this is that it's a single-stranded RNA. And so it means that other antiviral drugs, like potentially HIV drugs or remdesivir, which is the Ebola vaccine from Gilead, could potentially inhibit the reproduction of RNA, which is why mechanistically it's targeting that. And there are other drugs that are targeting different components of that early infection. And it's very early stage, and some of these drugs are approved. So they're in active human trials right now, and that's great. The thing is, late today, we got some bad news on Gilead's remdesivir. But it's something that we here at Next Edge Capital and our management, we completely anticipated a month ago that the Chinese trial, remdesivir, was highly likely to fail. And that's results that came out today, and Gilead got hit. And one of the reasons why we believed that the Chinese trial would actually fail is because they were enrolling patients outside of this circle. we think that remdesivir works in this early infectious stage where it could inhibit the reproduction of the viral RNA. The Chinese trial included patients that were already infected for 12, 15, 18 days and so on. So it's outside of this circle where an antiviral like that would be active. Once you get outside of the circle, this is where you get into something called the cytokine storm, where your body begins to launch an attack against that virus. And that's a whole different dynamic. That's the point where in launching the attack, you get the side effect. Your lungs fill up with a pink, gummy fluid, and you start to lose your breathing ability and so on. And that's your body's response against that virus that leads to these complications. So ideally, from the point of infection, you want to be attacking this in here. Outside of the circle is where you get the other drugs, sort of the IL-6 inhibitors and so on, that are active to try and suppress the body's response against it. So I've created this all-inclusive slide. It's a reference slide for you. I know it's very dense, but you can have it for yourself. And what I've tried to do is condense the entire therapeutic landscape of different approaches to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And I've broken it up in basically four basic areas: the therapeutics, in which are antivirals, repurposed drugs, the anti-inflammatories like the IL-6 inhibitors, and convalescent plasma. And then there's the preventative vaccines, where it's a prophylactic, and that's the one we really are looking for as a society, because it's the one thing that we could take that will help us build an immunity before we actually are infected, much like we take the flu virus. But that, I think, is most likely a year to two away. It just, when you're triggering an immune response, and there are novel approaches to that. You've got the traditional vaccines, which is sort of what J&J is approaching. Then you've got really novel approaches like what Moderna is approaching, which is it's literally using an RNA strand to trigger the production of the spike proteins by your body. And then by doing so, your body will develop immunity against it. But it's purely experimental, because Moderna hasn't developed anything past phase 2. So it's completely experimental. So we don't know what we don't yet know about that approach. It's novel. If it works, it's going to be, very significant. But I think it's further away than most have been saying. We heard from IMV today. There are sort of different approaches like INO and IMV that are DNA vaccine oriented, and that's an interesting approach to that. That may provide an approach that is more scalable and faster to get something that's available. But again, that's also novel. On the therapeutic side, we've already talked about the antivirals like remdesivir, and we all know about hydrochloroquine. Again, the verdict is out on it. You've got a malaria drug, but its therapeutic benefit is really within a narrow dose range. So what happens is, if you dose below that range, it's ineffective. If you dose above that range, you have side effects. So you've got a very narrow therapeutic range in which this drug can be used. It failed a trial yesterday, and so that's a negative against it short term. But on the other hand, it can't be ruled out yet, because we know a lot about this drug. It's been around for a long time, and it does target the viral RNA in that early infectious stage. So, but I suspect, given that it will be among, there are about, I guess somewhere in the order of 50 repurposed drugs that have been targeted right now. So just because a company announces that it's going to enter clinical trials with this repurposed drugs, there is no value added necessarily in that. It still has to go through and prove its effectiveness. And so an investor like me, I would rather wait for data. Again, you had the high promise with remdesivir and it failed. And we had the high promise with hydrochloroquine and it missed a trial yesterday. And we're going to see a lot of that. We're going to see a lot of back and forth with a lot of these drugs in the future. periods of hope, periods of despair, and back and forth until we have something definitive with data that we can say we can use it. Until such time, we're really experimenting with a lot of things, and that's fine. The FDA has really lowered the bar to allow repurposed drugs to be tested in humans. On the other side, we've got diagnostic testing, and diagnostic testing, again, there are multiple approaches. You heard Lexogene talk about RT-PCR. That is the gold standard in sort of central lab testing, and anyone that's able to bring that gold standard into something where you don't have to send a sample out to another site and wait days for the results. As a result of that, it definitely will have an edge up on the market. On the other side of that, you've had this plethora of tests. They're just flooding the market. You know, the bars seem very low as far as what you can. You know, just because you can identify an antibody doesn't mean that you're testing positive. And you know, companies like Microbics have fortunately come out with quality assessment tests that, you know, it'll provide a positive vaccine against which tests can be validated. So we're getting a lot of tests, and even the much ballyhooed Abbott test, you know, we're starting to see results that, you know, aren't quite up to promise. And so that is a consequence of the FDA's EUA, Emergency User Act, and that allows a company to market a test without having gone through the FDA validation tests. And so they're long on promise, maybe a bit shorter on delivery. So we need, you know, it's okay. It's not that it's okay, but it's not as adverse an impact to have a false positive. At least you're taking defensive measures. But false negatives, the consequence of a false negative is much greater. And so we need to be able to, at least in these tests, ensure against false negatives. And so a lot of these tests, the strip lateral flow type point of care tests, there's much to be desired. And now again, they're the fastest path to commercialization, and you can potentially make money from companies that come to market, sell the test, have a short mini boom in sales and so on, but you can be obsoleted overnight because another company will emerge with a test because the barriers to entry are very low, and they'll emerge with a test that is more efficacious, more sensitive, more accurate, and you're done, right? And so shareholders have to ask themselves when they're making investments in these companies is, are you playing the long game or are you playing the short game? Are you playing the near-term game for a company that's going to launch a product but will be obsoleted quickly? Or are you playing the long game for a company that's going to develop an antiviral or a vaccine, will require multiple fundraisers, capital raises to fund these trials, and carry some clinical risk along the way, but the payoff at the end of it will be bigger. Again, in this environment, the payoff also is questionable because you don't know if at the end of the day, when you develop a drug, the FDA is going to come back to you, and not the FDA, sorry, the government will come back to you and say, well, no, you cannot charge a big premium for this drug, even though your shareholders are risk capital to develop this drug. The government may come back and say, no, we will commandeer the production of this drug, and we will determine what price it can be sold and distributed at because, it's citizens first and so on. And that's some of the risks that companies incur investing in pandemic situations. You're already seen that. You've seen the president sort of implore companies to change, the production line to start producing ventilators and so on, and use almost thug tactics in a way to force companies to do things and shame them. And so we're not dealing with vaccines yet, or we're not dealing with antivirals yet, but that is potentially a threat for shareholders at the end of the day. I mean, we've seen giant companies like Gilead. So Gilead repurposed its Ebola antiviral, and it twice admitted it will not make any money on this. It will provide it at a cost. And not only that, it's gone a step further. It has orphan drug protection. Well, it has filed with the FDA to rescind that so that others can actually reproduce it. We've seen J&J say, even though it's not even in the clinic yet, it won't be in the clinic until the fall, said they're going to make it available at cost or less. And so for smaller companies going down that path, if larger companies are going to make it available at cost and not going to make any money, will smaller companies be able to profit from it? Because, you know, it's not a charity. They are redirecting, you know, company funds to these projects. And so at the end of the day, will there be a long-term economic payoff for them as a result of this? And, you know, so we're in a period, we're in the initial phase of this where you're getting even giant companies are getting huge bumps in market cap. You know, Gilead added 15 billion to its market cap, even though it said it will not earn a dime of profit on this. J&J added 20 billion, even though it said it's not going to make any money on this. And they're not even in the clinic yet. You know, you've seen Moderna triple in price for a highly experimental vaccine that has not, you know, none of its vaccines have crossed past phase 2 efficacy yet. And so it's a difficult environment. And I caution investors at this point in time to not chase headlines, not chase companies simply because they're repurposing a drug. You're a long way from results. It doesn't hurt to wait for data. To me, the real opportunities is less so on the therapeutic prevention side at this point, because you've got time with those. If you want to invest, there's probably more opportunity on the diagnostic side. You know, companies that will come out with a high quality test, companies that can validate the efficacy of tests, you know, companies that develop tests for highly specialized organs and so on. I think that's where the near-term value added will be. I think from an investment standpoint. Now, moving on to what gets this economy moving again, and vaccines are a ways away. Results from antivirals are a ways away. It's still experimental stage, but we need to get the economy moving. And what is going to make that possible near term is very accurate, cheap, sensitive point of care tests. And some of the things, this is a decision matrix that I created for you. I'm not going to go through it, but it's a decision matrix that I think a lot of policymakers may have to go through that determines whether we can, you know, to what extent we can reopen the economy. And, you know, I think one of the key things that makes it possible to get the economy working is, one, identifying those who are carrying antibodies, who may have been infected, but are carrying antibodies and have already some sort of immunity. They're probably safer to go in. The only issue with that is that as a carrier, do you now infect other people that have not yet been infected? And those are some of the decisions. So you need to have a dual function. The way I think countries like Taiwan and Singapore have done a really good job of this. They did not shut down their economy, but they had widespread testing, so that the moment that you registered as a potential positive on the test, you self-quarantined, right? You took yourself out of the system, you recovered, and then you were retested and you were okay to get back in. And so we need to have that widely accessible. And, you know, for more serious patients, obviously you'd go to, to the more expensive tests, the central lab tests. But I think we're also going to start, you know, in order to be able to identify those of us in the population that may not even be aware that we've been infected, but have developed antibodies. You need things, you know, cheaper, more accessible serological antibody tests out there. And, you know, Roche is obviously a leader in something like that. it's interesting. This week, the CEO of Roche went on a rant against serology tests because he felt that there were all these companies coming out making hollow promises as to their accuracy and so on, with a finger prick of blood and so on, whereas he feels sourcing blood in the veins is a way more accurate way of doing things. So, we're getting thought leaders that are fighting it out at this point to determine what is the best way to go about this. But those are just my thoughts on what we need to get this economy open again. And this, just to summarize, what we've talked about, I do think we live in the best of times, and, it may not seem that way. We're actually really fortunate that we live in an age of biotechnology, and we're just in the middle of this evolution of biology. And we're fortunate to have these tools available to develop, tools to battle this in the fastest imaginable time. When HIV broke out in the mid 80s, we had AZT, which was a terrible drug. I mean, talk about the cure being worse than the disease. It wasn't until a Canadian company, Biotech Pharma, developed 3TC, Epivir, that really made a huge difference. And then there were other antivirals, protease inhibitors that came along the way, but that took another 10 years. But we brought it under control. And then Gilead, who bought out one of my companies, Triangle Pharmaceutical, that ended up being a huge breakthrough for them that enabled them to now develop a vaccine. But this whole process took about 20 years for something like this. It was brand new. SARS-CoV is brand new, but we also already know a lot about coronaviruses. That's an advantage. We already know about SARS. So we have a head start on this. And so, it may take a bit longer than we want it to take, but it will work out. There will be solutions. As I mentioned, there's just been a huge number of announcements, companies throwing their hat in the ring. I did this slide on Monday. It's already outdated. There are 300 announcements of companies throwing their hat into the ring. There are almost 1,300 clinical trials that are either underway or will be underway in the next quarter. That's extraordinary. So it's actually using up a lot of the FDA's resources against where it otherwise would be focused. There are a number of different ways that we can approach a therapeutic vaccine. We've sort of talked about that. Different areas within the infection life cycle that we can attack. And, different solutions will emerge at different times, but it will be active. And I think the confidence that people need is that should you succumb, and I imagine over the years to come, many of us, and perhaps most of us, will at some point succumb to this virus. But it's very different to know that should you succumb, it's not a beeline to the ICU, but that it could be something that perhaps is like bronchitis or severe flu or at worst pneumonia, but at least it's treatable and you can recover from it. And I think we need to at least have the assurance of that, I think, in the next year. If we have that, I think it will give us a little more confidence to actually become more functional in society. For diagnostics, we need to be able to have more active, rapid diagnostic tests, and we need to distinguish, given the flood of tests that are now available out there, we need to distinguish between false positives and false negatives, especially false negatives. And so I think for small companies, many of them that we've seen here and many others that are not, the question is, what is the best use of shareholder capital? Is it worth chasing down this in which it's already very, very crowded? Do you have something that is truly unique, that is truly differentiating, or are you going on a hunch? And so that's one question, I think, for the companies. And for investors is that you really have to distinguish, you have to handicap what you think the odds are of this company developing a therapy or a test in a highly competitive environment against major competitors that are throwing much more money at things. So my approach has always been to wait on the data. Other people don't, and they do just fine that way. I would rather, there is time. There is time to wait for clinical results and decide. We've already seen, again, just this week, we've seen Gilead disappoint on a trial. That being said, I do think remdesivir works, and I think that in Gilead run trials, results which will come out, I think, before the end of May, we will see that remdesivir is active in the earlier phase of infection. And that we need that. We actually do need that right now. And then finally, just, ways to reopen society again. It's through confidence that we have something should we succumb, that it doesn't lead directly to the ICU, and we could apprehend it at a controllable way. And then towards, I think, the end of 2021, maybe early 2022, we have a vaccine that is at least active in some people. The SARS-CoV is complex. I think there's one aspect of it being an RNA, single-stranded RNA with one active site. It may not mutate as much as the flu does, which has 8 active sites. So that is a positive. When we do develop a vaccine, maybe it has greater durability. Much as we saw with SARS-CoV and H1N1 and so on. The more virulent they are, when you do develop an immunity, it lasts many, many years. You don't need a vaccine the way you do the flu vaccine, which mutates every single year. And but that was it for my presentation.
I think that's a wrap. Eden, thank you so much for taking the time to present, to teach us all a lot about biotech investing and COVID-19. Your contribution to this entire session has been incredibly meaningful, so thank you so much. And I will, like I said, I'll have a replay of the entire conference as well as Eden's session. And if anyone is looking at the space, trying to figure out A from B from C, I always recommend, if you don't know enough about a space, find a professional that does. And Eden, in my opinion, is the best biotech investor I know. And I know everyone. I'm just kidding. But I would say if you're interested in investing in the space, definitely have a look at Next Edge Capital. And he's had great returns. He's got great performance. And thank you, everyone, for participating in this event. Thanks to the sponsors, to Eden, to the presenting companies. I think it's been a really fun day.
Deborah, congratulations. This is a terrific event that you and your team put on here.
Well,
under very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, who would have thought I would have sat in my den and talked to hundreds of people all day, but it's been really fun. Thank you. Thank you all for participating, and stay healthy.